It's an Archaeodeath interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest.
Welcome, Archaeodeathlings, to this latest Archaeodeath interview with myself, Professor Howard Williams, explorer of all things deathly, past, present and future, and my special guest, who this week is Nicole. Nicole, would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, my name is Nicole Salomone. I am a second year PhD student at the University of Leicester in their Department of History. And I am looking into how death was defined during the late Enlightenment era in England and the tensions between the medical community and the public of the time.
Wow. So all things that I love, deathly, but a period and a discipline that's different from stuff I know about. Although we did explore some shared interests when you visited Chester a while back, and we got to look at the Sick to Death exhibition, which had, well, you know, death that for all anyone's interest is there. But I mean, I'm really interested in hearing more about your project. But before that, I'd like to know how you got into death history. I mean, is this from a medical route? Or just because you're one of those gothy death type people?
It's a little bit of both, actually. So I came to studying the history of medicine because I worked in the medical field, and I've worked there for a few decades. And all the while, I was studying the history of infectious disease. And in the 18th century, I've always loved the 18th century. But what I kept reading in the primary sources in the medical books of the time was this awareness and complacency about premature burial. And I didn't think too much of it because they didn't seem to worry about it. So why should I? And then I was watching the movie Master and Commander, and they talk about if a person appears to be dead, that a sailor would stitch up their hammock with the final stitch through the nose in case the person wakes up. And
yes,
I'd watched
very
the movie
evocative.
hundreds of times. Yep. But that time it all kind of clicked up in my head that this mistake would lead to somebody being prematurely buried. And I wondered, in what world would that be an acceptable outcome? And thus the slide to studying the history of death began.
And you've already an accomplished researcher in this field who's produced a book with McFarland, When the Dead Rose in Britain. So how did that actually happen? How did you get to the position of being already doing a PhD, but with already a book behind you?
So that was actually a fortuitous situation. The book is the build out of my master's thesis, which I was doing at the time, and I was at a conference giving a paper like you do, and the agent for McFarland happened to be in the audience. And when I came out of the panel, he came up to me and asked if I would like to do a book with McFarland on my research. So I finished my master's research and began writing the book for McFarland.
Wow, how long did that take? Was that a quick and easy process?
No. No, so I started the book in the, let's see, I guess it was November of 2019. And then it launched us straight into the pandemic. So while I was working in a hospital during the pandemic, I was going home and writing my book on death. So it took me about a year and a half to finish, and then another 6 months for peer review. And then
it's out in 2022, so that's pretty good. That's pretty.
It was out in 2022.
And from a master's thesis, and it sets you up in a wonderful position to build on in your own doctoral research. But so what did the book explore then? It explored this issue of the anxieties and realities of death, right? The raising dead, the fears around the dead coming back.
Yes. So it explored all that, but the way it did it was it looked at early vampire literature of the 19th century, as well as Dracula, because how can you talk about vampire literature and leave out Dracula? That's just not acceptable. So I explained the history of fears about being prematurely diagnosed as dead. I explained what the medical community was like at the time regarding theories that they understood about anatomy and physiology, and a germ theory hadn't been developed yet. So I explained that in the book. And then vampire literature, in a lot of ways, explored these same themes, but in a fictional setting. So it almost made these very real, scary situations a little more palatable for the public.
Wonderful, wonderful. And is your book leading in any direct or tangible way? I mean, it's obviously on your research is still on the 18th century, but is there a clear connection between your book and your current research, or is it more tangential?
It's a little more tangential. So the book does discuss the tensions between the medical community and the public, because the public was very aware that people were being diagnosed as dead and then coming back to life. And even if they didn't know somebody this happened to, it could happen in, we'll say that there were newspaper reports, many newspaper reports about this happening in England. There were newspaper reports about it happening in Scotland and Ireland and India and the US and the colonies, depending on where in the 18th century that fell. So people were reading about it happening. So even if they didn't know, they knew. Like the media did what the media does, and it furthered these issues into the purview of people who may not have already known about it. So yeah.
So it became just a global conversation / anxiety, regardless of how actual frequent people did.
Yes. Yes. Well, I can't speak on global, but I can say in British sources for the British public and the British medical community, it was certainly something that they looked at.
Right. So what's your doctoral research attempting to achieve? I know it's you're in the middle of it, you're knee deep in it, up to your neck in it, maybe, I don't know, but and it may be difficult to separate wood from the trees and so on, but what are you finding out in your doctoral research? What's the surprises maybe that have been coming?
Well, I can't tell you all the surprises, but I can tell you that between the 18th century, which is when the book focuses on, and then I look a little bit into the 19th century, that newspaper reports of these did continue and even became more frequent during the 19th century. I can tell you that the tensions were still there between the people who were aware of it and the doctors who were also aware of it, but they didn't have the necessary information about the human body to really do much about it. And that they were trying to get the respect of and the trust of the public. But how do you get the respect and the trust of the public when very possibly you're diagnosing somebody as dead and they're waking up during the funeral service?
So there's tension between the public and various professionals and various agents involved, agents as in the sense of people who are active involved in funerals, and it's a complex evolving picture, I imagine. Yes
it is, and I love it. That's what I love about it. There are so many different facets that I have to remember to focus, and then I can expand on it after the PhD.
So if we have this kind of modern cliche, that's so much of a cliche, I mean it became an insight and then became a cliche that death is taboo and no one talks about death, whilst we constantly talk about death, visualize death, engage with death. So if that's our modern era talking point about ourselves, what is the, I mean, I'm trying to think if I was going to try and do a crude first year introduction about the 18th century, I suppose what would be the generic, the general factoids that you're showing just don't make sense anymore? What are the kind of,
sure,
yeah, I'd be really interested in hearing about that.
So I love this question, instead of introducing the 18th century and what they knew, I would actually remove information as to what they didn't know, because most people are going to walk into a class with the same ideas. We know about infection control, we know about germ theory, we know about sepsis, we know just different things. We have a more robust understanding of how death works, which was mostly developed. A lot of this was developed between like 1860 and 1960, which completely misses the time period. So it would be like, welcome to the 18th century. There's no germ theory. We don't know how disease transmits. There's, we don't understand how to stop a raging infection. We don't have pharmaceuticals the way we have them now. So we just start building it, breaking it down and pulling it back. And then we say, we don't understand basic anatomy and physiology. In fact, the word physiology isn't regularly being used in anatomy and surgical lectures. Now, we have this problem. How would you treat it? And because that was more of the reality that they were working with. Even the most educated person would only know so much. It would know so much less than we know now.
It sounds to me that, I mean, again, correct me if I'm getting it wrong, that you could make an argument the 18th century is closer to the Bronze Age or the Roman period or any than it is to the modern era in terms of, that is such a fundamental basics, germ theory, all the points you made, the world without that, is very similar to most other periods of the human past then, or is that perhaps unfair?
I feel like it's a little unfair because the 18th century is where the foundation for what we consider to be anatomy and physiology, the understanding of the heart. Well, the heart came a little bit earlier, but the lungs and the brain and how it all works together, that started in the 18th century. That really built up into something that could be studied in the 18th century. So they were definitely in this like in between liminal phase of what they didn't know what they didn't know, and they didn't know what to trust about what they were learning. And a lot of that got kind of shook out in the 19th century. So it was almost like Legos. They were building their foundation for what we have now. So
it's more transitional than it actually is. It is quite away from earlier periods, but it's not quite in the modern era, so to speak. In terms of medicine.
Right. It is directly in between all of what was known and all of what they would learn.
And how much is archaeological evidence taking a part, or is that really not something you're touching on?
The book touches on that a little bit, but my PhD thesis does not. So in the book, I talked about the St. James Cemetery dig in London, which was led by the HS2.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, it's about 10 years ago, wasn't it? Yeah.
So how I believe they exhumed 36,000 bodies from the St. James burial ground. And so this exhumation was going on. And to me, as somebody who thought that maybe, if there were people who I knew very little, much less than I do now, about how archaeological digs work. But if a person was in a coffin, but maybe flipped over, or in a coffin, but not in a way that they should have been buried, maybe their knees are up near their torso, or their hands are out near their ears instead, or their skull rather than across their chest, maybe this would be indicative of a premature burial. But this was not something they were looking at. And also the types of burials that were done were mostly just like in the dirt burials, or they were wrapped up in muslin sorts of burials. They weren't actually in coffins, the vast majority of them.
Oh, fascinating. So what do you think of the broader themes and issues? Obviously, so much of your research is still to be, concluded, and I can't pick your brains about the things you're still aren't ripe for picking, so to speak. But what do you think? What's your sense of the broader themes or challenges we face in dealing with death in the past? Is it this modern preconceptions that are the major problems, or are there other things that we perhaps as historians and archaeologists we neglect in thinking about, that you're discovering information that reflects on?
I don't know. I see a lot of similarities, as you said earlier. There's although we engage with death all the time. We don't like to think about the end of life. And they didn't like to either.
No.
During the late 18th century, professionals started to do like the work of the dead. They used to, instead of the wake being in the home and the body being prepared by the family, professionals would do both and the body would be removed. And that separation between how to deal with somebody who is dead and then how to deal with your neighbors who are dealing with somebody who's dead started to become a more professional based business system rather than something that we engage with. After all, none of us are getting out of this alive.
Oh, no, don't say that. I still have hope. I will live on in a series of bad YouTube videos forever.
Well, that's fair. That's fair.
So, I mean, so there are similar, the 18th century people are more like us in the same anxieties and concerns in many ways. They may not have had our technology and our perhaps rational, or I don't know how many people are rational on social media these days, at least some people are rational, but you know, that sense of understanding, they don't have that sense of biological detail of what's going on. But I mean, so what do you think are the sort of final thoughts you would have for anyone thinking of doing research on death, you know, as a student of any discipline? And you know, why in particular PhD? I know you have strong opinions about that. Maybe that's a separate question we could come to, but you know, what final thoughts do you have on this whole escapade of being a doctoral researcher studying death?
It's not as scary as people think it is, but it is better to say things like, I have a particular fascination in the apparently dead to I like death. Because
Yes.
I like death.
Easy to be
Gets
misunderstood.
People away from you or where you are. Yes. Versus I have a particular fascination. I think it has to do with how you explain it to other people, maybe even more than what you're interested in. But if you're interested in studying the history of death, I'd say go for it, because you can do a lot with it, even in healthcare. You know, the bioethicists and policy and public relations and dealing with the media. An understanding of death and dying and the history of how it's been regarded by the public is something that you can use now.
Which leads me to ask you, because I know you have views on this, about the function of a PhD in relation to careers. Obviously, you know, it's perhaps unfair to ask you at this particular juncture, given how you're in the midst of this project. They always seem so huge. They are huge, you know. But you don't see this as simply a way into academia, do you? You have a broader sort of aspirations for how people think afresh about doctoral research. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah. It's a fair thing to say. I mean, I come out of a background in healthcare policy, and I'm looking forward to going back into it. I enjoy academia and different aspects that I did, obviously, before I even started. I was presenting a paper at a conference, which is how my McFarland agent found me. And I love that you can do academics as a part-time pursuit if you so choose.
So you think that the way universities are treating or supporting academics could evolve somewhat to reflect the fact that it's giving you advanced research skills that have wider application back in other fields whence the candidate came from, but also potentially elsewhere too.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, I think that a PhD candidate, or somebody with a PhD, could certainly go on to do just about anything that they're interested in, because they've got all of these cross skills. You know, you have great analyzation cross skills. You learn how to talk with people, how to do social media, how to do networking, public speaking. You get all of these wonderful skills that any business would be happy to have. But I don't feel like as a PhD student, we're seeing that explained to us a lot, either through the schools or from other people from outside academia coming to us saying we're interested.
So what would be the advice you'd give to any potential doctoral student in terms of the practicalities beyond don't do it? It's no, but I mean, no, I mean, is there anything further
I would never tell somebody not to do a
No,
PhD, but I would say have a goal. I think the best advice I've ever received regarding a PhD I got before I even considered it as a future prospect for me. And it was that the PhD is a tool. It's a key that will open doors for you. It's a tool to do what you want, but it shouldn't be the goal.
No.
So have a goal that your PhD will help open the door for.
I think that's a really healthy way of looking at it. And so you're sort of a wonderful role model in terms of your research so far, having come back to academia, having pursued a successful career, but also trying to apply those themes, to your research, and then, thinking for other people as well as yourself about the future, moving back into industry. And, this isn't just about being in an academic silo. This is a stage that can then circle back, contribute back. I think that's really, really important. Yeah. So,
Well, thank you.
So I think that's a really good point to say thank you and good night, Nicole. I really appreciate you joining us, and we'll put in the description below any further links to your book and any other links you would like us to share. But I think you've provided a window on the 18th century and on the challenges of studying it. And don't for everyone else, I don't have nightmares, but but it's but I certainly think that the more that burials can come back and tell us what's going on, the better. It's just I don't hold much hope with some of the skeletons I study, but if they could talk, I'm sure they'd just say, "Why are you digging me up, you old?" But no, but it's been wonderful, Nicole, and thank you so much, and good luck with all of your research moving forward. It must be such a busy time, and thank you for sharing your insights with us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been really great speaking with you.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Howard Williams on YouTube. In addition, consider following the Archaeodeath WordPress blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.